The Battle of Atlanta, a comprehensive analysis. The Battle of Atlanta, fought on July 22, 1864, was a pivotal engagement in the American Civil War. It was part of the larger Atlanta campaign, which aimed to capture the city of Atlanta, Georgia, a critical Confederate stronghold. The battle was a significant turning point in the war, as it not only demonstrated the Union's military prowess but also had profound political implications, particularly for the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln. This article will provide an in-depth analysis of the Battle of Atlanta, covering its historical context, key figures, strategic importance, military tactics, and lasting impact. Historical context. The American Civil War. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a conflict between the Northern states, the Union, and the Southern states, the Confederacy, that had seceded from the United States. The primary cause of the war was the issue of slavery, with the Southern states seeking to preserve and expand the institution, while the Northern states aimed to abolish it. The war was marked by significant battles, including the First Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, and the Battle of Gettysburg. The Atlanta Campaign. The Atlanta Campaign was a series of battles fought in the Western theater of the Civil War, with the objective of capturing Atlanta, Georgia. The campaign was led by Union Major General William T. Sherman, who sought to destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston. The campaign began in May 1864 and culminated in the Battle of Atlanta in July. Strategic importance of Atlanta. Atlanta was a crucial Confederate city, serving as a major transportation hub, industrial center, and supply depot. Its capture would sever the Confederacy's supply lines, weaken its war effort, and boost Union morale. Additionally, Atlanta's fall would have significant political implications, as it would demonstrate the Union's ability to win the war and potentially influence the outcome of the 1864 presidential election. Key figures. Union commanders. Major General William T. Sherman. Sherman was the overall commander of the Union forces during the Atlanta campaign. He was known for his aggressive tactics and strategic brilliance. Sherman's march to the sea after the capture of Atlanta would further devastate the Confederacy. Major General James B. McPherson. McPherson commanded the Army of the Tennessee, one of the three Union armies involved in the Atlanta campaign. He was a close friend of Sherman and a highly respected officer. McPherson was killed during the Battle of Atlanta, making him the highest-ranking Union officer to die in the war. Major General John A. Logan. Logan took command of the Army of the Tennessee after McPherson's death. He was a skilled and charismatic leader who played a crucial role in the Union victory at Atlanta. Confederate commanders. General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston was the initial commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee during the Atlanta campaign. He was known for his defensive tactics and reluctance to engage in direct combat. Johnston's cautious approach led to his replacement by General John Bell Hood. General John Bell Hood took command of the Army of Tennessee just before the Battle of Atlanta. He was an aggressive and daring commander who sought to take the offensive against the Union forces. Hood's tactics, however, would ultimately lead to heavy Confederate casualties. Lieutenant General William J. Hardee. Hardee was one of Hood's corps commanders and a veteran of several major battles. He played a significant role in the Confederate defense of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta. Prelude to the battle. By July 1864, Sherman's forces had advanced to the outskirts of Atlanta. Johnston's defensive strategy had delayed the Union advance, but had not stopped it. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, frustrated by Johnston's lack of aggression, replaced him with General John Bell Hood on July 17, 1864. Hood immediately sought to take the offensive and launched a series of attacks against the Union forces. The battle begins on July 20, 1864. Hood ordered an attack on the Union forces at Peachtree Creek, north of Atlanta. The attack was repulsed with heavy Confederate casualties. Undeterred, Hood planned another assault, this time targeting the Union forces east of Atlanta. On July 22, 1864, Hood launched a surprise attack on the Union Army of the Tennessee, commanded by McPherson. The Confederate forces, led by Hardee's corps, attempted to flank the Union Army and cut off its supply lines. The battle raged throughout the day, with intense fighting in areas such as Bald Hill and the Troop Hurt House. McPherson's death. During the battle, McPherson was reconnoitering the front lines when he encountered Confederate skirmishers. Despite attempts to escape, McPherson was shot and killed, His death was a significant blow to the Union forces, but they quickly rallied under the leadership of Major General John A. Logan. Union counterattack. Logan, known for his aggressive tactics, launched a counterattack that pushed back the Confederate forces. The Union Army's superior numbers and firepower eventually overwhelmed the Confederates, who were forced to retreat to the defenses of Atlanta. Aftermath. The Battle of Atlanta resulted in significant casualties on both sides. The Union suffered approximately 3,641 casualties, while the Confederates lost around 5,500 men. Despite the heavy losses, the Union emerged victorious, and the Confederate forces were forced to retreat into the city of Atlanta. Strategic and political implications. Union victory. The Union victory at Atlanta was a turning point in the Civil War. It demonstrated the effectiveness of Sherman's strategy and the resilience of the Union Army. The capture of Atlanta severed the Confederacy's supply lines and weakened its ability to continue the war. Impact on the 1864 presidential election. The Battle of Atlanta had significant political implications, particularly for the 1864 presidential election. Prior to the battle, President Abraham Lincoln faced growing opposition to the war, and his re-election was in doubt. The Union victory at Atlanta boosted Northern morale and strengthened Lincoln's position. He went on to win the election, ensuring the continuation of the war effort and the eventual abolition of slavery. Sherman's March to the Sea. Following the capture of Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his famous March to the Sea, a campaign of total war that aimed to destroy the Confederacy's infrastructure and morale. Sherman's march further weakened the Confederacy and hastened the end of the war. Military tactics and innovations. Union strategy. Sherman's strategy during the Atlanta campaign was characterized by maneuver warfare and the use of superior numbers to outflank and overwhelm the Confederate forces. Sherman avoided direct assaults on well-fortified positions, instead using his army's mobility to force the Confederates into unfavorable engagements. Confederate strategy. Under Johnston, the Confederate strategy was primarily defensive, aimed at delaying the Union advance and inflicting casualties without engaging in decisive battles. Hood, however, adopted a more aggressive approach, seeking to take the offensive and defeat the Union forces in open combat. Hood's tactics, while bold, ultimately led to heavy Confederate losses and the loss of Atlanta. Technological and tactical innovations. The Battle of Atlanta saw the use of several technological and tactical innovations. The Union Army employed rifled muskets and artillery, which provided greater accuracy and range compared to the smoothbore weapons used earlier in the war. Both sides also made use of field fortifications, such as trenches and earthworks, to protect their positions. Legacy and historical significance. The battle's place in Civil War history. The Battle of Atlanta is remembered as one of the most significant engagements of the Civil War. It marked a turning point in the conflict, demonstrating the Union's ability to achieve decisive victories and paving the way for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. Commemoration and memory. The Battle of Atlanta has been commemorated in various ways, including through monuments, reenactments, and historical preservation efforts. The Atlanta Cyclorama, a panoramic painting depicting the battle, is one of the most famous representations of the engagement. Impact on Atlanta. The fall of Atlanta had a profound impact on the city and its residents. The destruction caused by the battle and Sherman's subsequent march left Atlanta in ruins, but the city would eventually recover and become a major economic and cultural center in the post-war South. The Battle of Atlanta was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, with far-reaching consequences for both the military and political landscape of the United States. The Union victory demonstrated the effectiveness of Sherman's strategy and boosted Northern morale, while the fall of Atlanta weakened the Confederacy and contributed to the eventual Union victory. The battle's legacy continues to be remembered and studied as a key event in the history of the Civil War and the United States. The key strategic decisions made by General William Tecumseh Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta, fought on July 22, 1864, was a pivotal engagement in the American Civil War. It was part of the larger Atlanta campaign, which saw Union forces under the command of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman clash with Confederate troops led by General John Bell Hood. The battle was a critical moment in Sherman's march through Georgia, and his strategic decisions during this engagement played a significant role in the eventual Union victory. This article will explore the key strategic decisions made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta, examining how his leadership, tactical acumen, and understanding of the broader war effort contributed to the Union's success. The context of the Atlanta campaign. Before delving into the specific decisions made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta, it is essential to understand the broader context of the Atlanta campaign. By the summer of 1864, the Civil War had been raging for over 3 years, and the Union was determined to bring the conflict to a decisive conclusion. Atlanta, a major industrial and transportation hub in the South, was a key objective for Union forces. Capturing Atlanta would not only cripple the Confederate war effort but also boost Northern morale, which had been flagging due to the prolonged and bloody nature of the war. Sherman's Atlanta campaign began in early May 1864, with his forces advancing from Chattanooga, Tennessee, toward Atlanta, Georgia. The campaign was marked by a series of battles and skirmishes, including the Battle of Resaca, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and the Battle of Peachtree Creek. Throughout these engagements, Sherman demonstrated a keen understanding of the importance of maneuver and logistics, often outflanking Confederate positions and forcing his opponents to retreat. By mid-July, Sherman's forces had reached the outskirts of Atlanta, where they faced the Confederate Army of Tennessee, now under the command of General John Bell Hood. Hood, known for his aggressive tactics, was determined to defend Atlanta at all costs. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation. Sherman's decision to divide his forces. One of the key strategic decisions made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta was his decision to divide his forces. This decision was driven by several factors, including the need to maintain pressure on the Confederate defenses, the desire to cut off Atlanta's supply lines, and the goal of forcing Hood to disperse his troops. Sherman's Army of the Tennessee, commanded by Major General James B. McPherson, was positioned to the east of Atlanta, while the Army of the Cumberland, under Major General George H. Thomas, was located to the north. The Army of the Ohio, led by Major General John M. Schofield, was positioned to the northeast. By dividing his forces, Sherman was able to threaten multiple points along the Confederate defensive lines, making it difficult for Hood to concentrate his troops in any one area. This strategy of division also allowed Sherman to maintain flexibility in his operations. If Hood attempted to launch a counterattack against one of the Union armies, Sherman could quickly reinforce the threatened sector or launch an attack elsewhere along the line. This approach kept the Confederates off balance and prevented them from gaining the initiative. The decision to target Atlanta's railroads. Another critical strategic decision made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta was his focus on disrupting the city's railroads. Atlanta was a vital transportation hub for the Confederacy, with several major rail lines converging in the city. These railroads were essential for moving troops, supplies, and equipment, and their disruption would severely hamper the Confederate war effort. Sherman recognized the importance of Atlanta's railroads and made their destruction a key objective of his campaign. During the Battle of Atlanta, Union forces targeted the Macon and Western Railroad and the Atlanta and West Point Railroad, both of which were critical supply lines for the Confederate Army. By cutting these rail lines, Sherman aimed to isolate Atlanta from the rest of the Confederacy, making it difficult for Hood to receive reinforcements or supplies. The decision to target the railroads was not without risk. Confederate forces were well aware of the importance of these lines and had fortified their defenses accordingly. However, Sherman's troops were able to overcome these obstacles through a combination of aggressive assaults and clever maneuvering. The destruction of the railroads played a significant role in the eventual fall of Atlanta, as it left the city cut off and unable to sustain a prolonged defense. The use of feints and diversions. Sherman's use of feints and diversions was another key strategic decision during the Battle of Atlanta. Recognizing that Hood's forces were stretched thin and that the Confederate commander was prone to aggressive counterattacks, Sherman sought to exploit these weaknesses by creating confusion and drawing Confederate troops away from critical sectors of the battlefield. One notable example of this strategy was Sherman's decision to launch a feint against the Confederate left flank while simultaneously preparing a major assault on the right. This feint, carried out by elements of the Army of the Cumberland, was designed to convince Hood that the main Union attack would come from the north. As a result, Hood shifted a significant portion of his forces to reinforce the left flank, leaving the right flank vulnerable. With the Confederate right flank weakened, Sherman ordered the Army of the Tennessee, under McPherson, to launch a powerful assault in that sector. The attack caught the Confederates by surprise and resulted in significant gains for the Union forces. This successful use of feints and diversions demonstrated Sherman's ability to outthink his opponent and exploit the weaknesses in the Confederate defenses. The decision to envelop Atlanta. As the Battle of Atlanta progressed, Sherman made the strategic decision to envelop the city, cutting off all avenues of escape and supply for the Confederate forces. This decision was driven by Sherman's desire to avoid a protracted siege, which would have been costly in terms of both time and resources. Instead, Sherman sought to force Hood into a position where he would have no choice but to abandon Atlanta or risk being trapped and destroyed. To achieve this envelopment, Sherman ordered his forces to extend their lines around the eastern and southern sides of Atlanta, while maintaining pressure on the northern and western approaches. This maneuver required careful coordination and precise execution, as any gaps in the Union lines could have allowed the Confederates to escape or launch a counterattack. The envelopment of Atlanta was a risky move, as it stretched Sherman's forces thin and left them vulnerable to a concentrated Confederate assault. However, Sherman's confidence in his troops and his understanding of Hood's aggressive tendencies led him to believe that the risk was worth taking. The decision paid off, as the envelopment forced Hood to abandon Atlanta on September 1, 1864, marking a significant Union victory. The decision to avoid a direct assault on Atlanta's defenses. One of the most critical strategic decisions made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta was his decision to avoid a direct assault on the city's heavily fortified defenses. Atlanta was surrounded by a series of formidable earthworks, trenches, and artillery emplacements, making a frontal assault a costly and potentially disastrous proposition. Instead of launching a direct attack, Sherman opted for a more indirect approach, using maneuver and siege tactics to gradually wear down the Confederate defenses. This decision was influenced by Sherman's experiences in previous battles, where he had seen the devastating consequences of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. By avoiding a direct assault, Sherman was able to conserve his forces and minimize casualties, while still maintaining pressure on the Confederate defenders. This approach also allowed Sherman to exploit the weaknesses in the Confederate lines, as he could shift his forces to attack where the defenses were weakest or where the Confederates were least expecting an assault. The decision to avoid a direct assault on Atlanta's defenses was a testament to Sherman's strategic acumen and his understanding of the importance of preserving his forces for future operations. It also demonstrated his ability to adapt his tactics to the specific circumstances of the battlefield. Rather than relying on a one-size-fits-all approach, the decision to utilize artillery effectively. Sherman's effective use of artillery was another key factor in the Union victory at the Battle of Atlanta. Artillery played a crucial role in the Civil War, providing both offensive and defensive capabilities, and Sherman recognized the importance of using his artillery to its fullest potential. During the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's artillery was used to bombard Confederate positions, disrupt their supply lines, and provide covering fire for Union assaults. Sherman's gunners were highly skilled and well-trained, and they were able to deliver accurate and devastating fire on the Confederate defenses. One notable example of Sherman's effective use of artillery was during the Union assault on the Confederate right flank. As McPherson's troops advanced, Union artillery laid down a heavy barrage on the Confederate positions, softening up the defenses and allowing the infantry to make significant gains. The artillery fire also forced the Confederates to keep their heads down, reducing their ability to return fire and slowing their response to the Union assault. Sherman's decision to utilize artillery effectively was a key factor in the Union's success at the Battle of Atlanta. By combining the firepower of his artillery with the maneuverability of his infantry, Sherman was able to overwhelm the Confederate defenses and achieve a decisive victory. The decision to maintain pressure on Hood's forces throughout the Battle of Atlanta. Sherman made the strategic decision to maintain constant pressure on Hood's forces, preventing them from regrouping or launching a counterattack. This decision was driven by Sherman's understanding of the importance of keeping the initiative and not allowing the Confederates to gain any respite. Sherman's forces conducted a series of probing attacks and skirmishes, keeping the Confederates on edge and forcing them to remain in a state of constant readiness. This relentless pressure wore down the Confederate defenders, both physically and mentally, and made it difficult for Hood to coordinate any effective counterattacks. The decision to maintain pressure on Hood's forces was also influenced by Sherman's desire to avoid a prolonged siege. By keeping the Confederates off balance and preventing them from consolidating their defenses, Sherman was able to accelerate the fall of Atlanta and bring the campaign to a swift conclusion. The decision to exploit Hood's aggressiveness. Sherman's decision to exploit Hood's aggressiveness was another key strategic move during the Battle of Atlanta. Hood was known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to take risks, and Sherman recognized that this could be turned to his advantage. Throughout the battle, Sherman sought to lure Hood into making rash decisions by creating situations that appeared to offer opportunities for a Confederate counterattack. For example, Sherman's feint against the Confederate left flank was designed to draw Hood's forces away from the critical sectors of the battlefield, leaving them vulnerable to a Union assault. Hood's aggressiveness also played into Sherman's hands during the Union envelopment of Atlanta. As Sherman's forces extended their lines around the city, Hood launched a series of counterattacks in an attempt to break the Union encirclement. However, these attacks were poorly coordinated and ultimately unsuccessful, as Sherman's forces were able to repel them and maintain their positions. By exploiting Hood's aggressiveness, Sherman was able to manipulate the Confederate commander into making mistakes that ultimately contributed to the Union victory. This decision demonstrated Sherman's ability to understand and exploit the psychological aspects of warfare, as well as his skill in outmaneuvering his opponent on the battlefield. The decision to coordinate with other Union commanders. Sherman's decision to coordinate closely with other Union commanders was another key factor in the success of the Battle of Atlanta. The Atlanta campaign involved multiple Union armies, including the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Ohio, and effective coordination between these forces was essential for achieving victory. Sherman worked closely with his subordinate commanders, including McPherson, Thomas, and Schofield, to ensure that their operations were synchronized and that they were able to support each other on the battlefield. This coordination was particularly important during the envelopment of Atlanta, as it required the Union forces to maintain a continuous line around the city while still being able to respond to any Confederate counterattacks. Sherman's ability to coordinate with his commanders was also evident in his use of feints and diversions. By working closely with McPherson and Thomas, Sherman was able to create a situation where the Confederates were unsure of where the main Union attack would come from, allowing the Union forces to achieve surprise and gain the upper hand. The decision to coordinate with other Union commanders was a testament to Sherman's leadership skills and his ability to manage complex military operations. It also demonstrated his understanding of the importance of teamwork and collaboration in achieving success on the battlefield. The decision to adapt to changing circumstances. One of the hallmarks of Sherman's leadership during the Battle of Atlanta was his ability to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. The fluid nature of the battle required Sherman to be flexible in his tactics and to be willing to adjust his plans as the situation evolved. For example, when the initial Union assault on the Confederate right flank encountered heavy resistance, Sherman quickly shifted his focus to other sectors of the battlefield, where the defenses were weaker. This ability to adapt allowed Sherman to maintain the initiative and keep the Confederates off balance. Sherman's adaptability was also evident in his response to Hood's counterattacks. When Hood launched a series of assaults in an attempt to break the Union encirclement, Sherman was able to quickly redeploy his forces to meet the threat and repel the Confederate attacks. This flexibility was crucial in maintaining the Union's position and preventing the Confederates from gaining any advantage. The decision to adapt to changing circumstances was a key factor in Sherman's success at the Battle of Atlanta. It demonstrated his ability to think on his feet and to make quick decisions in the heat of battle, qualities that are essential for any successful military commander. The decision to focus on the bigger picture. Finally, Sherman's decision to focus on the bigger picture was a key strategic decision during the Battle of Atlanta. While the immediate objective was to capture the city, Sherman understood that the ultimate goal was to bring the Civil War to a swift and decisive conclusion. Sherman recognized that the fall of Atlanta would have far-reaching consequences for the Confederacy, both militarily and politically. The loss of such a vital city would cripple the Confederate war effort, disrupt their supply lines, and undermine their morale. It would also boost Northern morale and strengthen support for the Union cause. With this in mind, Sherman made decisions that were aimed not just at achieving a tactical victory on the battlefield, but at advancing the broader strategic goals of the Union. For example, his decision to target Atlanta's railroads was driven by the understanding that cutting off the city's supply lines would have a ripple effect throughout the Confederacy, weakening their ability to wage war. Sherman's focus on the bigger picture also influenced his decision to avoid a direct assault on Atlanta's defenses. While a frontal attack might have resulted in a quicker victory, it would have come at a high cost in terms of casualties and resources. By opting for a more indirect approach, Sherman was able to achieve his objectives while preserving his forces for future operations. The decision to focus on the bigger picture was a testament to Sherman's strategic vision and his ability to see beyond the immediate battlefield. It demonstrated his understanding of the interconnected nature of military and political objectives, and his commitment to achieving a lasting victory for the Union. The Battle of Atlanta was a defining moment in the American Civil War, and the key strategic decisions made by General William Tecumseh Sherman played a crucial role in the Union victory. From his decision to divide his forces and target Atlanta's railroads, to his use of feints and diversions, and his focus on the bigger picture, Sherman demonstrated a remarkable ability to outthink and outmaneuver his Confederate opponents. Sherman's leadership during the Battle of Atlanta was characterized by a combination of boldness, flexibility, and strategic vision. He understood the importance of maintaining the initiative, exploiting the weaknesses of his opponent, and adapting to changing circumstances on the battlefield. His decisions were driven by a deep understanding of the broader strategic goals of the Union, and a commitment to achieving a decisive victory that would bring the war closer to an end. The fall of Atlanta was a turning point in the Civil War, and it set the stage for Sherman's famous March to the Sea, which would further devastate the Confederacy and hasten the end of the conflict. The key strategic decisions made by Sherman during the Battle of Atlanta were not only instrumental in achieving this victory but also demonstrated the qualities of leadership and strategic thinking that would make him one of the most celebrated generals in American history. The Battle of Atlanta and its impact on the morale of the Union and Confederate armies. The American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in the history of the United States. It was a conflict that pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states, known as the Confederacy. The war was fought over a variety of issues, including states' rights, economic differences, and, most notably, the institution of slavery. Among the many battles that took place during this tumultuous period, the Battle of Atlanta stands out as a pivotal moment that had a profound impact on the morale of both the Union and Confederate armies. The Battle of Atlanta, which took place on July 22, 1864, was part of the larger Atlanta Campaign, a series of battles fought in the Western theater of the Civil War. The campaign was led by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, who sought to capture the city of Atlanta, a key Confederate stronghold and a vital hub for transportation and industry. The fall of Atlanta would not only be a significant military victory for the Union but also a psychological blow to the Confederacy, which had already been struggling to maintain its war effort. This article will explore the Battle of Atlanta in detail, examining the events leading up to the battle, the strategies employed by both sides, and the immediate aftermath. However, the primary focus will be on the impact of the battle on the morale of the Union and Confederate armies. By analyzing the psychological effects of the battle on the soldiers, as well as the broader implications for the war effort, we can gain a deeper understanding of how the Battle of Atlanta shaped the course of the Civil War. The road to Atlanta. The Atlanta Campaign. To fully appreciate the significance of the Battle of Atlanta, it is essential to understand the context in which it occurred. The Atlanta Campaign was a series of battles fought between May and September 1864, as part of Union General William T. Sherman's broader strategy to bring the Confederacy to its knees. Sherman's plan was to march through the heart of the South, capturing key cities and destroying Confederate infrastructure, thereby undermining the South's ability to wage war. The campaign began in early May 1864, when Sherman's forces, consisting of the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Ohio, began their advance from Chattanooga, Tennessee, towards Atlanta, Georgia. The Confederate forces, led by General Joseph E. Johnston, were tasked with defending Atlanta, a city that was not only a major transportation hub but also a symbol of Southern resistance. The campaign was marked by a series of battles and skirmishes, including the Battle of Resaca, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and the Battle of Peachtree Creek. Throughout these engagements, Sherman employed a strategy of flanking maneuvers, attempting to outmaneuver Johnston's forces and force them to retreat. Johnston, on the other hand, adopted a defensive strategy, seeking to delay Sherman's advance and inflict as many casualties as possible. By mid-July, Sherman's forces had reached the outskirts of Atlanta, and the stage was set for the decisive Battle of Atlanta. The city's fall would be a significant blow to the Confederacy, both militarily and psychologically, and both sides were acutely aware of the stakes involved. The Battle of Atlanta, July 22, 1864. The Battle of Atlanta took place on July 22, 1864, and was one of the most significant engagements of the Atlanta campaign. The battle was fought between the Union Army of the Tennessee, commanded by General James B. McPherson, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General John Bell Hood, who had replaced Johnston just days before the battle. The battle began in the early morning hours, as Confederate forces launched a series of attacks on the Union lines. Hood's strategy was to launch a bold, aggressive assault on the Union forces, hoping to catch them off guard and force them to retreat. However, the Union forces were well prepared, and despite initial Confederate successes, the Union lines held firm. The battle was marked by intense fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. One of the most notable moments of the battle was the death of Union General James B. McPherson, who was killed while attempting to rally his troops. McPherson's death was a significant blow to the Union forces, but they were able to regroup and continue the fight. As the day wore on, the Confederate forces launched several more attacks, but each time they were repulsed by the Union defenders. By the end of the day, the Confederate forces had been forced to retreat, and the Union forces had secured a decisive victory. The Battle of Atlanta was a turning point in the Atlanta campaign, and its outcome had a profound impact on the morale of both the Union and Confederate armies. For the Union, the victory was a much-needed boost to morale, coming after months of grueling campaigning and heavy casualties. For the Confederacy, the defeat was a devastating blow, both militarily and psychologically, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Southern war effort. The impact on Union morale. The Union victory at the Battle of Atlanta had a significant impact on the morale of the Union Army and the Northern population as a whole. The battle was a clear demonstration of the Union's military prowess and determination, and it provided a much-needed boost to morale after months of hard fighting and heavy casualties. A turning point in the war for the Union, the Battle of Atlanta was seen as a turning point in the war. The capture of Atlanta was a major strategic objective, and its fall was a clear sign that the Union was gaining the upper hand in the conflict. The victory at Atlanta was a testament to the effectiveness of Sherman's strategy of total war, which aimed to destroy the South's ability to wage war by targeting its infrastructure and economy. The Union soldiers who fought at Atlanta were well aware of the significance of the battle, and their victory filled them with a sense of pride and accomplishment. Many soldiers wrote letters home, expressing their joy at the victory and their belief that the end of the war was in sight. The victory at Atlanta also had a positive impact on the morale of the Northern population, who had grown weary of the long and bloody conflict. The fall of Atlanta was celebrated in the North as a major victory, and it helped to bolster support for the war effort. The death of General McPherson. While the Union victory at Atlanta was a cause for celebration, it was also marked by the tragic death of General James B. McPherson. McPherson was one of the Union's most promising young generals, and his death was a significant loss for the Union Army. However, his death also served to galvanize the Union troops, who were determined to avenge their fallen commander. McPherson's death was widely mourned in the North, and he was hailed as a hero who had given his life for the cause of preserving the Union. His death also served to highlight the sacrifices that were being made by the Union soldiers, and it helped to strengthen their resolve to see the war through to its conclusion. The impact on Sherman's campaign. The victory at Atlanta also had a significant impact on the morale of Sherman's army as they continued their march through the South. The fall of Atlanta was a clear sign that Sherman's strategy was working, and it gave the Union soldiers confidence that they could achieve their ultimate objective of bringing the Confederacy to its knees. The capture of Atlanta also provided Sherman with a base of operations from which he could launch his famous March to the Sea, a campaign that would see Union forces march through Georgia, destroying Confederate infrastructure and resources along the way. The success of the Atlanta campaign and the subsequent March to the Sea would further boost Union morale and contribute to the eventual Union victory in the Civil War. The impact on Confederate morale. While the Union victory at Atlanta was a cause for celebration in the North, it had the opposite effect on the Confederacy. The fall of Atlanta was a devastating blow to the Southern war effort, and it had a profound impact on the morale of the Confederate Army and the Southern population. The symbol of Southern resistance. Atlanta was more than just a military target. It was a symbol of Southern resistance and a key hub for the Confederate war effort. The city was a major transportation center, with railroads connecting it to other parts of the Confederacy, and it was also an important industrial center, producing weapons, ammunition, and other supplies for the Confederate Army. The fall of Atlanta was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it dealt a severe blow to Southern morale. The loss of such an important city was a stark reminder of the Union's growing strength and the Confederacy's inability to defend its territory. For many Southerners, the fall of Atlanta was a turning point in the war, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause. The replacement of General Johnston. The Confederate defeat at Atlanta was also marked by the controversial decision to replace General Joseph E. Johnston with General John Bell Hood just days before the battle. Johnston had been leading the Confederate forces in the Atlanta campaign, and his defensive strategy had been successful in delaying Sherman's advance. However, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was dissatisfied with Johnston's cautious approach and replaced him with Hood, who was known for his aggressive tactics. Hood's decision to launch a bold, aggressive assault on the Union forces at Atlanta was a gamble that ultimately failed. The Confederate forces suffered heavy casualties, and the Union victory at Atlanta was a clear sign that Hood's aggressive tactics were not effective against the well-prepared Union forces. The decision to replace Johnston with Hood was widely criticized in the South, and it further undermined Confederate morale. Many Southerners believed that Johnston's defensive strategy had been the right approach, and they blamed Davis and Hood for the loss of Atlanta. The controversy surrounding Johnston's replacement also highlighted the divisions within the Confederate leadership, and it further weakened the Southern war effort. The impact on Confederate soldiers. The fall of Atlanta had a profound impact on the morale of the Confederate soldiers who had fought in the battle. The defeat was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it left many soldiers feeling demoralized and disillusioned. The heavy casualties suffered by the Confederate forces at Atlanta were a stark reminder of the human cost of the war, and many soldiers began to question whether the Confederate cause was worth the sacrifices they were being asked to make. The fall of Atlanta also had a practical impact on the Confederate Army. The loss of such an important city meant that the Confederacy was losing access to vital resources and supplies, and it made it more difficult for the Confederate Army to continue the fight. Many Confederate soldiers began to desert, and the Confederate Army struggled to maintain its strength in the face of the Union's growing momentum. The impact on the Southern population. The fall of Atlanta also had a significant impact on the morale of the Southern population. The loss of such an important city was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it left many Southerners feeling hopeless and demoralized. The fall of Atlanta was a turning point in the war, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause. The fall of Atlanta also had a practical impact on the Southern population. The loss of such an important transportation and industrial center meant that the South was losing access to vital resources and supplies, and it made it more difficult for the Confederate government to continue the war effort. The fall of Atlanta also led to increased pressure on the Confederate government to negotiate a peace settlement, and it further weakened the Southern war effort. The broader implications of the Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta had far-reaching implications for both the Union and the Confederacy, and its impact extended beyond the immediate military and psychological effects. The battle had significant political, economic, and social consequences that would shape the course of the Civil War and its aftermath. The political impact. The Union victory at Atlanta had a significant impact on the political landscape of the United States. The fall of Atlanta came at a critical moment in the 1864 presidential election, and it played a key role in securing the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln. In the months leading up to the election, Lincoln's prospects for re-election had been uncertain. The war had dragged on for years, and many Northerners were growing weary of the conflict. The Democratic Party, which was opposed to the war, had nominated General George McClellan as its candidate, and there was a real possibility that Lincoln could be defeated. However, the Union victory at Atlanta provided a much-needed boost to Lincoln's campaign. The fall of Atlanta was seen as a clear sign that the Union was winning the war, and it helped to rally support for Lincoln and the Republican Party. Lincoln's re-election was a crucial moment in the Civil War, as it ensured that the Union would continue to fight for the preservation of the United States and the abolition of slavery. For the Confederacy, the fall of Atlanta was a political disaster. The loss of such an important city was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it undermined the Southern government's ability to continue the fight. The fall of Atlanta also led to increased pressure on Confederate President Jefferson Davis to negotiate a peace settlement, and it further weakened the Southern war effort. The economic impact. The fall of Atlanta also had significant economic implications for both the Union and the Confederacy. For the Union, the capture of Atlanta was a major strategic victory, as it gave them control over a key transportation and industrial center. The fall of Atlanta disrupted the Confederate supply lines and made it more difficult for the South to continue the war effort. The capture of Atlanta also provided the Union with access to valuable resources and supplies, which helped to sustain the Union war effort. The fall of Atlanta was a key moment in Sherman's strategy of total war, as it allowed him to launch his March to the Sea, a campaign that would further devastate the Southern economy and undermine the Confederate war effort. For the Confederacy, the fall of Atlanta was an economic disaster. The loss of such an important city meant that the South was losing access to vital resources and supplies, and it made it more difficult for the Confederate government to continue the war effort. The fall of Atlanta also led to increased inflation and economic instability in the South, further weakening the Confederate war effort. The social impact. The Battle of Atlanta also had significant social implications for both the Union and the Confederacy. For the Union, the victory at Atlanta was a source of pride and a reminder of the sacrifices that were being made to preserve the United States and abolish slavery. The fall of Atlanta was celebrated in the North as a major victory, and it helped to bolster support for the war effort. For the Confederacy, the fall of Atlanta was a source of despair and a reminder of the human cost of the war. The loss of such an important city was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it left many Southerners feeling hopeless and demoralized. The fall of Atlanta also led to increased pressure on the Confederate government to negotiate a peace settlement, and it further weakened the Southern war effort. The fall of Atlanta also had a significant impact on the lives of the people who lived in the city. The battle and its aftermath led to widespread destruction and displacement, and many residents of Atlanta were left homeless and destitute. The fall of Atlanta was a stark reminder of the human cost of the war, and it highlighted the devastating impact that the conflict was having on the civilian population. The Battle of Atlanta was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, and its impact on the morale of the Union and Confederate armies was profound. For the Union, the victory at Atlanta was a much-needed boost to morale, coming after months of grueling campaigning and heavy casualties. The fall of Atlanta was a clear sign that the Union was gaining the upper hand in the conflict, and it helped to rally support for the war effort. For the Confederacy, the fall of Atlanta was a devastating blow, both militarily and psychologically. The loss of such an important city was a clear sign that the Confederacy was losing the war, and it left many Southerners feeling hopeless and demoralized. The fall of Atlanta also had significant political, economic, and social implications, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause. The Battle of Atlanta was a turning point in the Civil War, and its impact on the morale of the Union and Confederate armies played a key role in shaping the course of the conflict. The victory at Atlanta helped to secure the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln and ensured that the Union would continue to fight for the preservation of the United States and the abolition of slavery. For the Confederacy, the fall of Atlanta was a stark reminder of the human cost of the war, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Southern war effort. In the end, the Battle of Atlanta was more than just a military engagement. It was a moment that defined the course of the Civil War and shaped the future of the United States. The impact of the battle on the morale of the Union and Confederate armies was a testament to the power of psychological warfare, and it highlighted the importance of morale in determining the outcome of a conflict. The Battle of Atlanta remains a defining moment in American history, and its legacy continues to be felt to this day. The long-term effects of the Battle of Atlanta on the Atlanta Campaign. The American Civil War, a pivotal conflict in United States history, was marked by numerous significant battles and campaigns that shaped the nation's future. Among these, the Atlanta Campaign and the Battle of Atlanta stand out as critical events that had profound long-term effects on the course of the war and its aftermath. This article delves into the intricate details of the Atlanta campaign, focusing on the Battle of Atlanta, and explores the enduring consequences that reverberated through the South, the Union, and the broader context of American history. The Atlanta Campaign, a strategic overview. The importance of Atlanta. Atlanta, Georgia, was a crucial hub for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Its strategic location made it a vital center for transportation, industry, and supply lines. The city served as a major railroad junction, connecting various parts of the South, and was a key manufacturing center, producing munitions, textiles, and other war materials. The capture of Atlanta would not only cripple the Confederate war effort but also deal a significant blow to Southern morale. The objectives of the Atlanta Campaign. The Atlanta Campaign, which lasted from May to September 1864, was a series of battles fought in northwestern Georgia and around Atlanta. Union General William T. Sherman led the campaign with the primary objective of capturing Atlanta. The campaign was part of the broader Union strategy to divide the Confederacy and bring the war to a swift conclusion. Sherman's forces faced Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee, which was tasked with defending Atlanta and delaying the Union advance. The course of the Atlanta Campaign. The campaign was characterized by a series of flanking maneuvers, skirmishes, and battles as Sherman's forces advanced toward Atlanta. Key engagements included the Battle of Resaca, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and the Battle of Peachtree Creek. Despite fierce resistance from Confederate forces, Sherman's relentless pressure and superior numbers gradually pushed Johnston's army back toward Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta, a turning point. The prelude to the battle. By July 1864, Sherman's forces had reached the outskirts of Atlanta. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, dissatisfied with Johnston's defensive strategy, replaced him with General John Bell Hood. Hood, known for his aggressive tactics, sought to take the offensive and drive the Union forces back. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation. The Battle of Atlanta, July 22, 1864. The Battle of Atlanta, fought on July 22, 1864, was a pivotal engagement in the Atlanta Campaign. Hood launched a series of attacks against Sherman's forces, aiming to break through the Union lines and relieve the pressure on Atlanta. The battle was marked by intense fighting, particularly around Bald Hill, later known as Leggett's Hill, and the Troophurt House. Despite initial successes, Hood's assaults were ultimately repulsed, and the Confederates suffered heavy casualties. The aftermath of the battle. The Union victory at the Battle of Atlanta was a significant turning point in the campaign. Although the city did not fall immediately, the battle demonstrated the Union's determination and ability to overcome Confederate resistance. The loss further weakened the Confederate position and set the stage for the eventual capture of Atlanta in September 1864. The fall of Atlanta and its immediate consequences. The siege of Atlanta. Following the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's forces tightened their grip on the city. A prolonged siege ensued, during which Union artillery bombarded Atlanta, causing widespread destruction and civilian suffering. The Confederate defenders, under Hood's command, struggled to hold out against the relentless Union pressure. The evacuation and burning of Atlanta. On September 1, 1864, Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta, recognizing that the city could no longer be held. The following day, Union troops entered Atlanta, marking a significant victory for the Union. In November, as part of his March to the Sea, Sherman ordered the burning of Atlanta's military and industrial facilities, further crippling the Confederate war effort and leaving the city in ruins. The impact on Confederate morale and strategy. The fall of Atlanta was a devastating blow to the Confederacy. The loss of such a vital city undermined Southern morale and weakened the Confederate war effort. It also had political ramifications, as the Union victory bolstered Northern support for President Abraham Lincoln and his administration, particularly in the lead-up to the 1864 presidential election. The long-term effects on the Atlanta Campaign. The strategic significance of Atlanta's capture. The capture of Atlanta had far-reaching strategic implications for the Union. It severed key Confederate supply lines, disrupted communication and transportation networks, and deprived the South of a major industrial and logistical center. The fall of Atlanta also demonstrated the effectiveness of Sherman's strategy of total war, which aimed to destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war by targeting its infrastructure and resources. The psychological impact on the Confederacy. The loss of Atlanta had a profound psychological impact on the Confederacy. It shattered the illusion of Southern invincibility and exposed the vulnerabilities of the Confederate war effort. The fall of Atlanta also undermined the confidence of Southern leaders and citizens, contributing to a sense of despair and resignation as the war dragged on. The influence on Union strategy and morale for the Union. The capture of Atlanta was a major morale booster. It reinforced the belief that victory was within reach and galvanized support for the war effort. The success of the Atlanta campaign also validated Sherman's approach to warfare, which emphasized the importance of targeting the enemy's economic and logistical infrastructure. This strategy would later be employed in Sherman's March to the Sea and his subsequent campaigns in the Carolinas. The broader implications of the Atlanta campaign. The impact on the 1864 presidential election. The fall of Atlanta had significant political ramifications, particularly in the context of the 1864 presidential election. The Union victory bolstered Lincoln's re-election campaign, as it demonstrated the progress being made in the war and reinforced the perception that the Union was on the path to victory. Conversely, the loss of Atlanta dealt a blow to the Confederate cause and weakened the position of those advocating for a negotiated peace. The role of the Atlanta campaign in shaping post-war Reconstruction. The Atlanta campaign and the fall of Atlanta played a crucial role in shaping the post-war Reconstruction era. The destruction of Atlanta and the surrounding region highlighted the devastating impact of the war on the South and underscored the need for a comprehensive Reconstruction plan. The campaign also set the stage for the eventual reunification of the nation and the efforts to rebuild the South's economy and infrastructure. The legacy of the Atlanta campaign in American military history. The Atlanta campaign is remembered as one of the most significant military campaigns of the Civil War. It showcased the importance of strategic planning, logistics, and the effective use of combined arms in achieving military objectives. The campaign also highlighted the evolving nature of warfare, with an increasing emphasis on total war and the targeting of civilian infrastructure. The economic consequences of the Atlanta campaign. The devastation of Atlanta's economy. The fall of Atlanta had a devastating impact on the city's economy. The destruction of industrial facilities, railroads, and other infrastructure crippled Atlanta's ability to function as an economic hub. The loss of manufacturing capacity and transportation networks disrupted supply chains and hindered the South's ability to sustain its war effort. The impact on agriculture and trade. The Atlanta campaign also had significant repercussions for agriculture and trade in the region. The destruction of railroads and other transportation infrastructure disrupted the movement of goods and commodities, leading to shortages and economic instability. The loss of Atlanta as a major trading center further exacerbated the economic challenges faced by the Confederacy. The long-term economic recovery of Atlanta. In the aftermath of the war, Atlanta faced the daunting task of rebuilding its economy. The city's recovery was slow and arduous, but over time, Atlanta emerged as a major economic center in the South. The reconstruction of railroads, the establishment of new industries, and the influx of investment helped to revitalize the city's economy and lay the foundation for its future growth. The social and cultural impact of the Atlanta campaign. The displacement of civilians. The Atlanta campaign and the subsequent fall of the city resulted in the displacement of thousands of civilians. The destruction of homes, businesses, and infrastructure forced many residents to flee the city in search of safety and shelter. The displacement of civilians had long-term social and cultural consequences, as families were uprooted and communities were fractured. The impact on race relations. The Atlanta campaign also had a significant impact on race relations in the region. The presence of Union troops and the eventual occupation of Atlanta brought about changes in the social dynamics of the city. The emancipation of enslaved people and the establishment of Freedmen's Bureau offices in Atlanta marked the beginning of a new era in race relations, as African Americans sought to assert their rights and freedoms in the post-war South. The cultural legacy of the Atlanta campaign. The Atlanta campaign left a lasting cultural legacy in the region. The destruction and subsequent rebuilding of Atlanta became a symbol of resilience and renewal. The campaign also inspired numerous works of literature, art, and music that reflected the experiences of those who lived through the conflict. The memory of the Atlanta campaign continues to shape the cultural identity of the city and the broader South. The military lessons of the Atlanta campaign. The importance of logistics and supply lines. The Atlanta campaign underscored the critical importance of logistics and supply lines in military operations. Sherman's ability to maintain a steady flow of supplies and reinforcements was a key factor in the success of the campaign. Conversely, the Confederacy's struggles with logistics and supply shortages highlighted the challenges of sustaining a prolonged war effort. The role of leadership and strategy. The Atlanta campaign demonstrated the importance of effective leadership and strategic planning in achieving military objectives. Sherman's innovative tactics, including the use of flanking maneuvers and the targeting of enemy infrastructure, set a new standard for military strategy. The campaign also highlighted the consequences of poor leadership, as evidenced by the Confederate decision to replace Johnston with Hood, which ultimately proved detrimental to the Southern cause. The evolution of warfare. The Atlanta campaign marked a significant evolution in the nature of warfare. The increasing emphasis on total war, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and the use of combined arms reflected the changing dynamics of military conflict. The lessons learned from the Atlanta campaign would influence future military strategies and tactics, both in the United States and abroad. The political ramifications of the Atlanta campaign. The impact on Confederate politics. The fall of Atlanta had profound political ramifications for the Confederacy. The loss of such a vital city undermined the credibility of Confederate leadership and fueled internal divisions. The failure to defend Atlanta exposed the limitations of the Confederate war effort and contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment among Southern leaders and citizens. The influence on Union politics. For the Union, the capture of Atlanta was a major political victory. It reinforced the perception that the Union was making progress in the war and bolstered support for Lincoln's administration. The success of the Atlanta campaign also strengthened the position of those advocating for a hardline approach to the war, as opposed to a negotiated settlement. The role of the Atlanta campaign in shaping national policy. The Atlanta campaign played a crucial role in shaping national policy during and after the Civil War. The Union victory at Atlanta demonstrated the effectiveness of a comprehensive and aggressive military strategy, which would later be applied in other theaters of the war. The campaign also highlighted the importance of economic and logistical factors in achieving military success, influencing post-war policies related to infrastructure development and economic reconstruction. Chapter 10: The Legacy of the Atlanta Campaign in American History. The Atlanta Campaign as a turning point in the Civil War. The Atlanta Campaign is widely regarded as a turning point in the Civil War. The capture of Atlanta marked a significant shift in the balance of power in favor of the Union and set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. The campaign demonstrated the Union's ability to conduct large-scale military operations and achieve strategic objectives, paving the way for the final stages of the war. The enduring significance of the Atlanta Campaign. The Atlanta Campaign holds enduring significance in American history. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by both Union and Confederate soldiers and civilians during the Civil War. The campaign also highlights the complex interplay of military, political, and economic factors that shaped the outcome of the conflict. The legacy of the Atlanta Campaign continues to be studied and remembered as a pivotal chapter in the nation's history. The Atlanta Campaign in popular memory. The Atlanta Campaign has left a lasting imprint on popular memory and culture. The events of the campaign have been immortalized in literature, film, and other forms of media, ensuring that the story of Atlanta's fall and its aftermath remains a part of the national consciousness. The campaign's legacy is also preserved through historical sites, monuments, and museums that commemorate the sacrifices and struggles of those who lived through the conflict. The Battle of Atlanta and the broader Atlanta campaign were defining moments in the American Civil War. The capture of Atlanta had profound and far-reaching consequences that extended beyond the immediate military and political outcomes of the campaign. The long-term effects of the Atlanta campaign shaped the course of the war, influenced the post-war Reconstruction era, and left a lasting legacy on the nation's history. The campaign serves as a testament to the resilience and determination of those who fought and lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. As we reflect on the Atlanta campaign, we are reminded of the enduring impact of this pivotal chapter in the story of the United States. The Battle of Atlanta and its influence on the 1864 presidential election. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in United States history, a conflict that pitted the northern states, the Union, against the southern states, the Confederacy, over issues of states' rights, slavery, and the future of the nation. By 1864, the war had dragged on for 3 years, with immense casualties and no clear end in sight. The presidential election of 1864 occurred against this backdrop of uncertainty, and its outcome would determine the direction of the war and the future of the United States. The Battle of Atlanta, fought from July 22 to September 2, 1864, emerged as a pivotal event that significantly influenced the election. This article explores how the Union victory at Atlanta reshaped public opinion, bolstered President Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign, and ultimately secured his victory, ensuring the continuation of the war effort and the eventual preservation of the Union. The context of the 1864 presidential election. The State of the Union in 1864. By 1864, the Civil War had entered its 4th year, and the Union was facing significant challenges. Despite early victories, the war had become a protracted and bloody conflict. The Union Army had suffered heavy losses, and public support for the war was waning. The Northern population was growing weary of the endless fighting, and there was increasing pressure to negotiate a peace with the Confederacy. President Abraham Lincoln, who had been elected in 1860, was seeking re-election. However, his prospects were far from certain. Lincoln faced opposition not only from the Democratic Party but also from within his own Republican Party. Some Republicans, known as Radical Republicans, believed that Lincoln was too moderate in his approach to the war and to the issue of slavery. They favored a more aggressive strategy and the immediate abolition of slavery. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, was deeply divided. The Peace Democrats, also known as Copperheads, advocated for an immediate end to the war and a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. The War Democrats supported the war effort but were critical of Lincoln's leadership and his handling of the conflict. The Democratic nomination and platform. The Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago in August 1864. The party nominated General George B. McClellan, a former commander of the Union Army, as its presidential candidate. McClellan was a popular figure among the troops, but he had a contentious relationship with Lincoln. He had been relieved of his command in 1862 due to his cautious approach to warfare and his reluctance to engage the Confederate Army aggressively. The Democratic platform, known as the Chicago Platform, called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. The platform criticized Lincoln's handling of the war and his Emancipation Proclamation, which had declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. The Democrats argued that the war had become a crusade against slavery rather than a fight to preserve the Union, and they sought to appeal to war-weary voters who were eager for an end to the conflict. Lincoln's re-election campaign. Lincoln's re-election campaign was fraught with challenges. The president faced criticism from both the left and the right. Radical Republicans believed that Lincoln was not doing enough to end slavery, while Peace Democrats accused him of prolonging the war unnecessarily. Lincoln's prospects were further complicated by the fact that the Union Army had suffered a series of setbacks in the early months of 1864, including the bloody Battle of the Wilderness and the Siege of Petersburg. In an effort to broaden his appeal, Lincoln formed a coalition known as the National Union Party, which included Republicans and War Democrats. The party's platform called for the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy and the abolition of slavery. Lincoln's running mate was Andrew Johnson, a War Democrat from Tennessee, who was chosen to appeal to Southern Unionists and to demonstrate Lincoln's commitment to national unity. Despite these efforts, Lincoln's re-election was far from assured. The president himself doubted his chances of winning, and there was widespread speculation that he would be defeated. The outcome of the election would hinge on the military situation and the public's perception of the war's progress. The Battle of Atlanta, a turning point in the war. The strategic importance of Atlanta, Georgia, was a key strategic target for the Union Army. The city was a major transportation hub and industrial center for the Confederacy, serving as a critical supply depot and manufacturing center for the Southern war effort. Capturing Atlanta would not only disrupt the Confederate supply chain but also deal a significant blow to Southern morale. In the spring of 1864, Union General William T. Sherman launched his Atlanta campaign, with the goal of capturing the city and breaking the Confederate hold on the Deep South. Sherman's campaign was part of a broader Union strategy to apply pressure on multiple fronts, with General Ulysses S. Grant leading the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater. Sherman's forces faced stiff resistance from Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who employed a strategy of defensive warfare, retreating and fortifying positions to slow the Union advance. However, Johnston's cautious approach drew criticism from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who replaced him with General John Bell Hood in July 1864. Hood, known for his aggressive tactics, sought to take the offensive and drive Sherman's forces back. The Battle of Atlanta began on July 22, 1864, when Hood launched a series of attacks on Sherman's forces. The fighting was intense and bloody, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite initial Confederate successes, the Union Army managed to repel Hood's assaults and maintain its position around the city. Over the next several weeks, Sherman's forces gradually tightened their grip on Atlanta, cutting off supply lines and bombarding the city with artillery. On September 1, 1864, Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta, and Union troops entered the city the following day. The fall of Atlanta was a major victory for the Union and a significant turning point in the war. The impact of the Union victory. The capture of Atlanta had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Militarily, it dealt a severe blow to the Confederacy, disrupting its supply lines and weakening its ability to wage war. The loss of Atlanta also had a profound psychological impact on the Southern population, undermining confidence in the Confederate government and its ability to achieve victory. For the Union, the victory at Atlanta was a much-needed boost to morale. It demonstrated that the Union Army was capable of achieving decisive victories and that the tide of the war was turning in favor of the North. The fall of Atlanta also vindicated Lincoln's strategy of total war and his commitment to the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy. The Battle of Atlanta and the 1864 presidential election. The political impact of the Union victory. The timing of the Union victory at Atlanta could not have been more fortuitous for Lincoln's re-election campaign. The news of the fall of Atlanta reached the northern states in early September, just as the presidential campaign was entering its final weeks. The victory provided a powerful counter-narrative to the Democratic Party's message of war weariness and the need for a negotiated peace. The capture of Atlanta was widely celebrated in the northern press, and it dominated the headlines in the weeks leading up to the election. Newspapers that had been critical of Lincoln's leadership now praised his steadfastness and the success of his military strategy. The victory at Atlanta was seen as a vindication of Lincoln's policies and a sign that the Union was on the path to victory. Shifting public opinion. The Union victory at Atlanta had a profound impact on public opinion in the North. Prior to the fall of Atlanta, many Northerners had grown disillusioned with the war and were skeptical of Lincoln's ability to lead the nation to victory. The Democratic Party's message of peace and reconciliation resonated with a war-weary population, and there was a real possibility that Lincoln could be defeated. However, the fall of Atlanta changed the political landscape. The victory reinvigorated support for the war effort and bolstered Lincoln's standing with the electorate. It demonstrated that the Union Army was capable of achieving decisive victories and that the end of the war might be in sight. The victory also undercut the Democratic Party's argument that the war was unwinnable and that a negotiated peace was the only viable option. The role of the media. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception of the Battle of Atlanta and its impact on the election. Northern newspapers, many of which had been critical of Lincoln, now rallied behind the president and celebrated the Union victory. Editorial cartoons, illustrations, and articles depicted the fall of Atlanta as a turning point in the war and a testament to Lincoln's leadership. The Democratic press, on the other hand, sought to downplay the significance of the victory. Some Democratic newspapers argued that the fall of Atlanta was a minor setback for the Confederacy and that the war was far from over. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful in countering the wave of optimism that swept through the North in the wake of the victory. The impact on the Democratic campaign. The fall of Atlanta dealt a severe blow to the Democratic Party's campaign. The party's platform, which called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a negotiated peace, was now seen as out of touch with the realities of the war. The victory at Atlanta demonstrated that the Union was capable of achieving military success, and it undermined the Democratic argument that the war was unwinnable. General George B. McClellan, the Democratic nominee, found himself in a difficult position. While he personally supported the war effort, he was constrained by the party's platform and the views of the Peace Democrats. McClellan attempted to distance himself from the more extreme elements of the party, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. The fall of Atlanta made it difficult for McClellan to present himself as a viable alternative to Lincoln, and his campaign struggled to gain traction in the final weeks of the election. The role of the soldier vote played a significant role in the 1864 election, and the fall of Atlanta had a profound impact on the morale and political views of Union troops. Many soldiers had grown disillusioned with the war and were sympathetic to the Democratic Party's message of peace. However, the victory at Atlanta reinvigorated their commitment to the war effort and bolstered their support for Lincoln. The Union Army implemented a system that allowed soldiers to vote in the field, and the soldier vote ultimately proved to be a critical factor in Lincoln's re-election. The fall of Atlanta demonstrated to the troops that victory was possible, and it reinforced their belief in Lincoln's leadership. The soldier vote helped to secure key states for Lincoln, including New York and Pennsylvania, and contributed to his overall victory. The election results. The 1864 presidential election was held on November 8, 1864. Abraham Lincoln won a decisive victory, capturing 212 electoral votes to George B. McClellan's 21. Lincoln won 55% of the popular vote, compared to McClellan's 45%. The president carried all but 3 states, Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey, and won a majority of the votes in the key battleground states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The fall of Atlanta was widely seen as a key factor in Lincoln's victory. The victory reinvigorated support for the war effort and bolstered Lincoln's standing with the electorate. It demonstrated that the Union was capable of achieving decisive victories and that the end of the war might be in sight. The victory also undercut the Democratic Party's argument that the war was unwinnable and that a negotiated peace was the only viable option. The long-term impact of the Battle of Atlanta. The continuation of the war effort. Lincoln's re-election ensured the continuation of the Union war effort and the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. With Lincoln at the helm, the Union Army continued to press its advantage, and the fall of Atlanta marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. In the months following the election, Sherman's forces embarked on the famous March to the Sea, a campaign of total war that devastated the Southern economy and further weakened the Confederate war effort. The fall of Atlanta also had a significant impact on the morale of the Southern population. The loss of such a key city undermined confidence in the Confederate government and its ability to achieve victory. Desertions from the Confederate Army increased, and support for the war effort waned. The abolition of slavery. Lincoln's re-election also ensured the eventual abolition of slavery in the United States. The president had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring the freedom of all slaves in Confederate-held territory. However, the proclamation was a wartime measure, and its long-term impact depended on the outcome of the war. With Lincoln's re-election, the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, became a realistic possibility. The amendment was passed by Congress in January 1865 and ratified by the states in December 1865, following the end of the war. The fall of Atlanta and Lincoln's re-election were critical steps in the journey toward the abolition of slavery and the eventual reunification of the nation. The legacy of the Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta left a lasting legacy on American history. The victory was a turning point in the Civil War, and it played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the 1864 presidential election. The fall of Atlanta demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Union Army and the Northern population, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The battle also had a profound impact on the political landscape of the United States. Lincoln's re-election ensured the continuation of the war effort and the eventual preservation of the Union. The victory at Atlanta reinvigorated support for the war and bolstered Lincoln's standing with the electorate, paving the way for the eventual abolition of slavery and the reunification of the nation. The Battle of Atlanta was a pivotal event in the American Civil War, and its impact on the 1864 presidential election cannot be overstated. The Union victory at Atlanta reinvigorated support for the war effort, bolstered Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign, and ultimately secured his victory. The fall of Atlanta demonstrated that the Union was capable of achieving decisive victories and that the end of the war might be in sight. It undercut the Democratic Party's message of war weariness and the need for a negotiated peace, and it paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery and the reunification of the nation. The Battle of Atlanta and its influence on the 1864 presidential election serve as a powerful reminder of the interconnectedness of military and political events. The outcome of the battle shaped the course of the war and the future of the United States, and it remains a defining moment in American history. The main challenges faced by Hood's army during the Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta, fought from July 22 to September 2, 1864, was a pivotal engagement in the American Civil War. It marked a critical moment in the Atlanta campaign, a series of battles waged between Union forces under Major General William T. Sherman and Confederate forces under General John Bell Hood. Hood's army faced numerous challenges during this campaign, which ultimately contributed to the Confederate defeat and the fall of Atlanta. These challenges can be categorized into strategic, logistical, tactical, and morale-related issues. Strategic challenges: Hood's appointment and lack of preparation. One of the most significant challenges Hood faced was his sudden appointment to command the Army of Tennessee. On July 17, 1864, Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced General Joseph E. Johnston with Hood, citing Johnston's perceived reluctance to engage Sherman's forces aggressively. However, Hood's promotion came with little time to prepare or establish a cohesive strategy. Unlike Johnston, who had focused on defensive maneuvers and preserving his army, Hood favored aggressive tactics. This shift in leadership style created confusion and disrupted the Army's operational continuity. Sherman's superior numbers and resources. Hood's army was significantly outnumbered and outgunned by Sherman's Union forces. Sherman commanded over 100,000 troops, while Hood had approximately 50,000 men. The Union Army also had access to better supplies, including ammunition, food, and medical resources. This disparity in manpower and resources forced Hood to rely on defensive positions and limited offensive actions, which were often costly and ineffective. Sherman's flanking maneuvers. Sherman was a master of maneuver warfare, and his ability to outflank Confederate positions posed a constant threat to Hood's army. During the Atlanta campaign, Sherman repeatedly bypassed Confederate defenses, forcing Hood to retreat or risk being encircled. This relentless pressure stretched Hood's forces thin and made it difficult to maintain a coherent defensive line. Logistical challenges. Supply shortages. The Confederate Army of Tennessee faced chronic supply shortages, which severely hampered its effectiveness. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were often in short supply, leaving soldiers underfed and ill-equipped. The Union blockade of southern ports and the destruction of railroads by Sherman's forces exacerbated these shortages, making it nearly impossible for Hood to sustain his army in the field. Transportation issues. The Confederate railroad system, which was vital for moving troops and supplies, was in poor condition. Sherman's forces targeted railroads as part of their strategy to cripple Confederate logistics. The destruction of key rail lines, such as the Western and Atlantic Railroad, disrupted Hood's ability to reinforce his troops or evacuate wounded soldiers. This lack of reliable transportation further isolated Hood's army and limited its operational flexibility. Urban warfare in Atlanta. As the battle shifted closer to Atlanta, Hood's army had to contend with the challenges of urban warfare. The city's infrastructure was ill-suited for large-scale military operations, and the presence of civilians added complexity to the situation. Hood's forces struggled to defend the city while also managing the logistical demands of urban combat, such as securing supply routes and evacuating non-combatants. Tactical challenges. Hood's aggressive tactics. Hood's preference for aggressive tactics often put his army at a disadvantage. Unlike Johnston, who had focused on defensive strategies to preserve manpower, Hood launched several costly frontal assaults against entrenched Union positions. These attacks, such as the Battle of Peachtree Creek and the Battle of Atlanta, July 22, resulted in heavy casualties and failed to achieve significant strategic gains. Hood's inability to adapt his tactics to the realities of the battlefield further weakened his army. Lack of coordination. The Confederate command structure was plagued by poor coordination and communication. Hood's subordinates, including Generals William J. Hardee and Benjamin Cheatham, often disagreed with his decisions, leading to delays and missteps during critical moments. This lack of cohesion undermined the effectiveness of Confederate operations and contributed to their eventual defeat. Union artillery superiority. Sherman's forces had a significant advantage in artillery, which they used to devastating effect against Hood's army. Union artillery bombardments inflicted heavy casualties and disrupted Confederate formations, making it difficult for Hood to mount effective counterattacks. The Confederates, by contrast, lacked the resources to match the Union's firepower, leaving them at a tactical disadvantage. Morale and leadership challenges. Low morale among troops. The Confederate Army of Tennessee suffered from low morale, exacerbated by months of retreats, defeats, and harsh living conditions. Hood's aggressive tactics and the high casualty rates further demoralized his troops, many of whom had lost confidence in their leadership. This decline in morale affected the Army's combat effectiveness and contributed to desertions. Hood's leadership style was a double-edged sword. While his aggressiveness initially inspired some troops, his reckless decision-making and inability to adapt to changing circumstances eroded trust among his officers and men. Many soldiers viewed Hood as a poor replacement for Johnston, whose cautious approach had at least preserved the Army's strength. Civilian discontent. The civilian population of Atlanta also posed a challenge for Hood. As the battle raged on, residents grew increasingly desperate, and their discontent added to the pressure on Confederate leaders. Hood had to balance the need to defend the city with the realities of civilian suffering, which further complicated his decision-making. The fall of Atlanta. Despite Hood's efforts, the Confederate Army of Tennessee was unable to prevent the fall of Atlanta. On September 1, 1864, Hood ordered the evacuation of the city, and Union forces occupied it the following day. The fall of Atlanta was a major turning point in the Civil War, boosting Northern morale and securing President Abraham Lincoln's re-election. For Hood, it was a devastating defeat that underscored the challenges he had faced throughout the campaign. The Battle of Atlanta highlighted the immense challenges faced by Hood's army, from strategic and logistical difficulties to tactical missteps and morale issues. Hood's aggressive tactics, while bold, were often ill-suited to the realities of the battlefield, and his army's lack of resources and coordination further compounded these problems. Ultimately, these challenges proved insurmountable, leading to the fall of Atlanta and a significant setback for the Confederate cause. The battle remains a testament to the complexities of military leadership and the harsh realities of war.